is the tough on crime era. It is a time in our country where politicians could earn political points on both sides of the aisle by locking up as many people as possible. And particularly during this time, I want to take you to California, who was a leader in a very bad way in locking people up, and particularly in locking kids up. So eventually, in the summer of 1996, lawmakers realized, hey, this probably isn't a good idea. We shouldn't be locking so many kids up. We should be treating children like children, and passed Senate Bill 681, SB 681. And this bill put a price on incarcerating kids. And what do I mean by that? Well, to fully explain that, I'm going to have to take a step back and talk to you about how it worked previously. So before the passage of SB 681, for every kid that was incarcerated, the local county would only have to pay $25, and the state would foot the rest of the bill. Now, if you know anything about prisons, anything about jails, you know that they're very expensive. It normally costs thousands of dollars to incarcerate a single person. So in this case, counties really aren't paying a lot. It's sort of like a drop in the bucket for counties. So in come SB 681. This bill says, hey, counties, and when I say counties, county officials are the ones who are in charge of putting people in jail, determining what sort of sentences they have to serve, how long they're going to be there. So SB 681 says, hey, county and county officials, if you're going to incarcerate kids, you're going to have to pay a price. And that price is going to depend on the reason why you are incarcerating kids. So if you're incarcerating a child for something serious, like murder or robbery, you're going to pay $150 a month. But if you're incarcerating a kid for something dumb, so a violation of parole, low-level misdemeanor, you're going to have to pay $2,600. And we saw that this bill made a significant difference in the population. So it reduced the number of people who are in jail. And there was a study by this woman out of the University of Pennsylvania, a criminologist named Aurelie Aus, who found that 1,543 children, fewer children, were sent to juvenile prisons in the year after the law passed. So I'm going to repeat that number. That's 1,543 fewer children were sent to juvenile prisons after that law was passed. And the likelihood that a child would be sent to prison went down by 40% over a 4-year period. And get this, Als also found that the law didn't appear to affect public safety. So after the 6 years after it passed, we found that violent crimes went down, arrests went down, and reported property crimes all went down during those years. So this was a law that not only made it so that we were sending much fewer kids to prisons in California, but also might have even made us safer. And so this really begs the question of how can we bring this sort of reform to other parts of the country? And luckily, we have somebody who is an expert in this. His name is Adam Dershowitz, no relationship to Alan Dershowitz, luckily for us. He is a law professor at William & Mary Law School who's written at length about this topic. He's here with us today to answer that question. Professor, thanks so much for joining us on The Appeal Live.
Hi, thank you. Nice to be here. I appreciate you having me.
Great to have you. So as it stands right now, prosecutors across the country sort of operate under the same framework that did California back in 1996, meaning they can incarcerate as many people as possible, don't have to realize the financial implications of that. And so you call this the correctional free lunch. Can you talk a little bit about how that works and how it impacts mass incarceration overall?
Yeah, I'm certainly not the first person to come up with that term. Smarter people than me thought of that first. But the correctional free lunch, parents will understand this, especially around the holidays this time of year, because your kids say to you, I want this, I need that, this would be a great gift for me. And it seems as though they want more and more. And it's easy for children to want more and more because they don't have to pay for it, as most parents know when it comes to holiday season and that time of year. The correctional free lunch is the same idea with respect to prisons and jails. And so prosecutors operate for the most part at the county level. Your local county has an elected, typically county prosecutor with a staff of prosecutors that work underneath her or underneath him. And those people make charging decisions, and they have an enormous amount of influence about whether or not a case is going to be plea bargained and result in a conviction, or whether or not a case will be dismissed. Prosecutors, not everybody agrees with this, but most people tend to agree, hold a tremendous number of cards in the criminal justice systems. They have all this charging power, and they have a lot of influence as to whether a person gets convicted, but they don't have to pay typically for the prisons that they send these individuals to. That's going to be handled usually at the prison level by the state, and the state budget will have to account for that. And so in the way we think about this as a correctional free lunch is the idea that the prosecutors can charge as many people as they think is appropriate, but they don't have to, once those cases walk out the door of their courtroom, they don't have to think about what it costs or what the difficulty is of incarcerating those individuals for weeks, months, years, decades into the future.
So it's interesting because I think about this, and a part of me wonders, well, why does there need to be this sort of financial disincentive from locking kids up? I mean, why don't other incentives work? And what excuse do prosecutors use to explain this sort of approach of incarcerating so many people?
Yeah, so I think there's a variety of ways to look at this. There's the sort of way to look at it as, prosecutors are, behaving in borderline bad behavior. There's a group of people, and I would count myself in this group of people who think, the prosecutors, they're really good-natured, good-intentioned people, but sometimes they get carried away, or their office pushes them in a direction and they hear it day in and day out and grow accustomed to it. But for whatever reason, sentences tend to go up over time. The going rate for a crime in terms of punishment tends to go up over time. And as a result, plea bargains tend to be tougher over time with longer prison sentences attached to them. It could be that we have a sort of nation of vindictive prosecutors. I tend to come at it as a more of things happen sort of as a natural flow of events because there's no one stepping in to shut down that event from happening. And so prosecutors tend to seek what they think are appropriate sentences, but for whatever factors and reasons, those sentences have grown over time, and a little bit of growth here and there obviously has a big effect on somebody's life if they're the one that's going to be incarcerated, but it also has sort of a broad-based effect on the total of what's going on in a prison or jail, how full it is, how difficult it is to maintain safety and nutrition and all of that stuff when a prison or a jail is overcrowded. And when you add all of those things up over time, it causes real problems, not just for the individuals, which are real problems for those individuals, but systemically.
And you've actually written a whole proposal of what we should be doing instead, which is in 2016, you've published a paper that said that prosecutors' offices, rather than sheriffs or other law enforcement agencies, should, just like you're talking about, be in charge of jail budgets, be in charge of intake. Can you explain, sort of get down to the nitty-gritty of exactly how that would work and how the duties of prosecutors versus sheriffs would work under that model?
Yeah, so most people have no concept of who does what in the criminal justice system. It's this black box that most ordinary citizens have really no understanding of. And people like me who are professors that study it maybe have a slightly better understanding. And then folks who work in the system have a better understanding than I would, to be perfectly honest. But the reality is there's tons of different people in the departments and in these jobs that are in control of different pieces of the system. And almost universally across the country, sheriff's offices tend to be in charge of jails. And there's long historical reasons for that that aren't particularly relevant or interesting, actually. But it's just the fact of life that the sheriff's office runs the jail. A lot of places have an elected sheriff who oversees that. The prosecutors are elected typically at the county level, and they have folks that work for them. They're two different entities. And so the prosecutor doesn't really have to bear responsibility for what the sheriff does. And if the jail is overcrowded, it's not the prosecutor who has to go to the county commissioner or the city council or whatever it is and beg for more resources. It's the sheriff that has to do that. And they say to the sheriff, well, this is your problem. You have to make do with the resources that we provide to you. And the sheriff says, well, I don't control what's brought in, the prosecutor, the judges, but really, in great part, the prosecutor is going to have a lot of control over the size of the jail population by how many people he or she is charging. And so there's a great disconnect there where we think we're improving things, and usually we are, by not letting too much power be held in the hands of one or two or a small number of people. But there are downsides. There's real downsides to dividing power in the criminal justice system. And one of those downsides is the person who's in charge of the jail is different than the person who's in charge of putting people in the jail. And as a result, it leads to overpopulation, it leads to longer sentences. And so the pitch that I've made in this law review article that, as you mentioned, came out a couple of years ago is certainly, I know a lot of lawyers and I've trained a lot of prosecutors. I don't think they should be guarding inmates and, running day-to-day operations in the jail. But there's lots of other stuff that goes on in the jail. There are logistical things. There's a person who's in charge of policy and overseeing people being checked in and checked out and big picture concepts. I'm not entirely sure or clear why that should be the sheriff as opposed to the prosecutor, because if the prosecutor has some skin in the game, as we might say, right, where the prosecutor has to deal with the prison overcrowding or the jail overcrowding, and the prosecutor has to deal with, we don't have enough beds for people, we don't have enough food, we don't have a safe environment for the inmates or for the correctional officers. If we put the prosecutor in charge of that, the prosecutor might say to herself or himself, wow, this place is overcrowded, it causes real trouble. I see inmates or individuals who are being held who are not being treated properly and it's dangerous. Maybe I should do something about that in my other capacity, which is the capacity of charging and plea bargaining and making recommendations for sentences. And so the theory is fairly simple, I think, which is if prosecutors had more skin in the game, if they had some responsibility for what went on in the jail, they, I think, would dismiss more cases, low-level cases, the kind of things you mentioned when talking about the University of Pennsylvania professor, her study, disorderly conduct charges, things like that. They might dismiss more cases, or for cases where they really do think jail is appropriate, they might offer lighter deals. They might offer lesser plea bargaining sentences that would result in people staying less time, and therefore the jail as sort of to close out this idea, if you think of it as a balloon with air in it, just sort of letting out a little bit of air with each individual. And if you let out a little bit with each individual that's held in a 100 or 200 or 500 person capacity jail, you're really letting out a substantial chunk of air in the system and decreasing incarceration, I think.
And I really like this phrase that you use, which is skin in the game, because you're absolutely right that prosecutors are the folks who are sending people to jail and prison, and so they should really understand the implications of that. Can you bring us up to speed on any other ideas for how to sort of oblige local officials to have more skin in the game when it comes to incarceration?
Yeah, there's definitely big ideas, and a professor colleague of mine, Dave Ball, out at Santa Clara, has suggested some stuff. These are harder ideas to go with, but one way to do it would be to say, look, the state is funding all of these individuals who are being sent over from the counties by the prosecutors. And so maybe the state should allocate beds to counties on a certain level, right? And say, you in this particular county have this level population and this size and this much crime. And we think, you'll get this many beds in our jail for this many times or incidents per year. And after that, you have to start paying into the system. Now, that'd be a very difficult political sell, because if you think about it, state prisons and jails are almost like an entitlement that exists. And saying to a county now, you've gotten this for free forever and ever, now you're going to have to start paying for it above whatever level we set them at. People are not going to like that. And that'd be a difficult proposal to put into effect. So that's a bold proposal. I think it's a great idea. It's very difficult to implement, I think. You could go to a much more modest idea, and a much more modest idea might say, and this is less skin in the game than just sort of being in the game to start with. I think your average prosecutor, and I come at it from a place of, I think those are good people doing a hard job, trying their best. I think your average prosecutor has no idea what's going on in your typical correctional facility, right? So they don't go to a state prison. They spend relatively little time in the jail, except potentially to offer plea deals to individuals who are awaiting trial. I don't think they have a good picture. Why is it that we don't send someone from the jail in to brief them or inform them on a weekly or a monthly basis, either by electronic communication from email or having someone show up in the courtroom? And that's the kind of thing that, not just for the prosecutors, but the judges as well, because the judges ultimately do sentencing in most cases when there's not an agreed upon deal that's been worked out. If they were better informed, they might at the margins sort of let the air out of the balloon themselves rather than being sort of forced to or tricked into it, as the way that I'm suggesting in my proposal. And so they run the spectrum from, well, we could just do an informational approach, and we think maybe they might behave better with an informational approach. We could do a carrot and stick approach, which is my idea of sort of requiring them to oversee the facility that they're placing people into. Or we could take a really bold approach and say, look, if you want to use this state resource, a state prison, you've got to start paying into it, along the lines of the California statute that you're talking about to open the show with. That's just not done in most places. Most places do not sort of put a hefty price tag on this for counties, and we could start doing it. It'd be difficult to sell, though, and so it'd be an uphill battle, I think.
Do you see any places that implement any of these reforms or anything close to them that are starting to work?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's a hard question to answer, right? Because along the lines of what we've been talking about, how everything is separated into all these different spheres, there's thousands of counties in the United States, right? And so different approaches exist, but they're hard to find out and ferret out, which is why I think the study that you referenced from the professor at Penn at the beginning is such a great piece of work that shows us what's actually going on the ground. The one thing that I have seen, and there may be bolder things than this that I'm just not aware of, but the one thing I've seen is in larger jurisdictions, they have coordinating councils of sort of major players in the criminal justice system, where they have someone who's sort of tasked with riding herd over the whole operation, who's going to talk with and bring together the sheriff and the prosecutor and the public defender's office and sort of look at these problems from a sort of 30,000 foot view and have all the players in the room to get together and discuss it. I think in a smaller community, you're less likely to see that. You're more likely to see the elected prosecutor and the sheriff hang out over a beer or go play basketball or darts or something like that. And maybe there's sort of an informal word of mouth where some of this gets out. But in bigger cities, I know, for instance, when I lived in Houston, Texas, and taught down there was a coordinating committee of criminal justice that operated in the county. And so that can be done, but then you're funding another administrative position to do this. And at a certain point, we have to start thinking about how much more money are we going to keep pouring into the criminal justice system? And when are we going to start taking some of that money out of the system and using it for more rehabilitative programs and less things that are focused on incarceration, quite frankly?
And when you bring all of that up, specifically when you talk about differences between places where, prosecutors and defense attorneys can play darts together versus not, I think about, it makes me wonder sort of how prosecutors would respond to this, particularly in areas where the system is a bit more adversarial, to any sort of reform efforts looking to create more skin in the game for prosecutors.
Yeah, I always hesitate to guess what someone else will say, but I will guess that they would hate this idea and would not like it, right? They'd say to themselves, and I've written a paper on this topic too, I think your average prosecutor's office works really hard. They're very overburdened. They have a ton to do. And if you give them more things to do, even if it's only one or two administrators, it's just making their life much more complicated to do. And so I suspect most prosecutors would not love the idea of the added responsibility of this. That said, I never want to try a new type of vegetable when it's served to me at dinner, but sometimes you try it and it's great for you and you like it. Not often in my case, but sometimes. I think sometimes in the criminal justice system, there's just a tremendous amount of status quo where a prosecutor, or this is also true of public defenders, but I think more so of prosecutors, something is presented to them and the answer is, well, this is how we do it. This is how we've done it. This is how we're going to do it. And those are always the same thing. And so, always the same thing has gotten us a system where we have 2+ million people incarcerated. And we have a fairly broken criminal justice system. And so the idea of experimenting with who's the figurehead in charge of a jail might seem like an enormous change to the prosecutor's office. But if it's going to help to decrease the level of incarceration and perhaps make the system function a little better, I don't think it's such a massive change that we can't experiment with it. Now, I'm an academic, so it's easy for me to say that. The people on the front lines who do this every day might tell you that you should listen less to the academics and more to the people who are doing this day in and day out. But sometimes you need an outside person to sort of say, let's try something new.
Absolutely. And I think one thing we can't deny is that this is a system that has so many real consequences on people's lives. So any sort of proposal that makes it so that prosecutors can actually feel that consequence is definitely worth trying. So thank you so much for being with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you all for watching. You can follow us on The Appeal on Twitter and Facebook. We will be out next week. I hope everybody enjoys a restful season. And thank you again so much.